Welcome to the Community Development Podcast, a podcast dedicated to community development practice and approaches, sharing our learning and connecting the workforce. My name is Russell. It's episode 53 and it's all welcome to the podcast to Ritva Vilppola. How are you, Ritva?
I'm good, thank you, Russell.
Lovely to have you. We're going to get a little bit beneath the skin of what you do and where you're from, because where you're from is not where you're based now. We'll come back to that in a moment. But a quick shout out to Stein in episode 52, who I had a wonderful time speaking with for the previous episode. We talked for a lot longer actually than what the episode ended up being. There was quite a bit cut out. We went right round the houses. But Stan worked for a number of years on a project that, if you've looked at UK community/regen policy through any sort of historical lens, chances are you'd have touched upon the Adult Learning Project based in Edinburgh, the west of Edinburgh, in the Gorgie Dalry districts. It started in 1979, which in terms of sort of Thatcherism and the impact on society in the UK is a seminal year when she became Prime Minister. But it was also seminal in Edinburgh for the start of the Adult Learning Project, very explicitly drawn the teachings and ideas of Paulo Freire, and who would have been alive for a large part of that programme as well. In 1989, they wrote a book about the ALP. There's been a couple of editions sort of republished since then. Stan's retired now, although I couldn't help but think he's probably busier now in retirement than he was whenever he was working, given what he was talking about in terms of music and performance and the Cayleys that they used to bring people together. But yeah, wonderful kind of look back on not just a seminal project and a very important project in terms of British policy, but I think it had a bit of an international perspective as well in terms of the number of people that came and sort of visited and studied and looked at that through that Freirean lens. So yeah, that was episode 52. A big thanks to Stan for joining me on that one. Less of episode 52. Let's start talking about episode 53. And Ritva, like I said, welcome to the podcast. Do you want to say a little bit about yourself? Because you're based in the Netherlands, but from New Zealand originally. So from New Zealand to Old Zealand, I suppose.
Correct. Very much so. And also a bit of Australia in between that as well. But yes, basically I have a bit of a Venn diagram, if you were to visualize something, in terms of my background, which is a bit of architectural science, a bit of urban development and design, then community development and work, and recently very much quite a lot on labour and labour justice. So I guess starting from a bit of the beginning, I was raised in Aotearoa-New Zealand. I'm actually what I consider myself a multi-ethnic third culture kid. So basically that means I grew up with two parents from very different cultures. So my name is actually Finnish, but my mum is Chinese. And then third culture kid essentially means that I grew up in my childhood development years in another country, which is Aotearoa-New Zealand, to my passport country, which was, well, Hong Kong, but actually on my passport it was actually British because of colonialism there as well. And so I very much went to a, New Zealand school, very Western schooling system, and my favourite subjects were actually geography, visual arts and physics, which kind of created a very good ground to go into architecture school, where I was very much inspired or motivated more so than anything else in relation to housing quality. So the issues around poor housing, particularly in marginalised communities. So in New Zealand we have Indigenous Māori peoples and communities, as well as Pacifica Islander migrants, and a lot of the time the history very much goes towards the marginalisation of the urban fabric, and a lot of the time social housing is poorly built, which leads to mould issues, ventilation issues, and that creates a whole geographical consequence on the healthcare system as well. So, for example, asthma, as well as strep throat, which can lead to rheumatic fever and heart surgery for these kids, which is really, when I was a child, I was absolutely horrified because I watched a documentary of heart surgery and I was like, oh, this is terrible. I would not, cannot imagine the consequences of this. So I linked it back to architecture, and I was very much motivated to learn about how to design better quality homes. And that essentially led to me working for the Green Building Council, which looked at standardisation of better quality homes and buildings, and also worked in environmentally sustainable design engineering, where I moved to Australia and worked on the consultancy design side. And that very much created sort of the bubbling of the soup almost in relation to workers' rights, my own personal experience with poor management, experiences with emergencies and the bushfires and floods in 2019 in Australia as well. And so I really had to kind of take a break or reevaluate what I was doing and the greenwashing that comes with it. And that led me to community development, which I worked at my local neighbourhood centre for a couple of years, which linked with my interest in urban design and development, looking at kind of housing, disaster management, placemaking, policy, and active transport. And then I've kind of come full circle back to architecture, but looking at workers' rights and community development from a union organising, community organising perspective as well here in the Netherlands. I feel like that was a bit of a ramble, but
It's fascinating, and I mean, this is an unscripted question actually. So sorry to sort of throw this at you, but you're talking about some of the housing side of things. To what extent were you looking at that, or you and others involved in that work looking at it through a rights-based perspective rather than maybe a sort of like a technical or an architectural one as well?
So in terms of housing, especially at the neighbourhood centre, I was amazed when I first moved across, because I was like, oh, what is the grassroots perspective in comparison to an engineering and technical perspective? And just the amount of community that's already engaged in these housing issues was really insightful for me as someone coming from a technical perspective, and very much looked at the assets of the community at hand. And there were a lot of community members who were already campaigning about this stuff, or already having the entrepreneurial kind of mindset to create alternative homes, but also a lot of emergency shelter as well. And we very much had a multi-pronged approach where I was able to kind of integrate my technical and engineering perspective with the more sort of shelter as a human right perspective from the community. And so we were able to also very much create like demands or policy demands and legal demands to our local council in relation to demanding better rights, particularly for people who are living in temporary housing that's defined by the council as either cars or caravans, tiny homes that essentially don't go through the technical process of meeting building code requirements, but people are already living like this because of the housing crisis. Yeah,
no, it reminds me, just as you were talking, episode 47, we were back in Edinburgh, as it happens, with Hannah Kitchen Kirby and Claire McGilvery, and they were looking at some housing or given a flavour of some of the housing related work that they've been involved in. Hannah was in Leith in Edinburgh at the Cables Wine House, which is better known as the Banana Flats, because of the sort of like the gentle sort of curve to their construction, but featured in train spotting and things like that. And Claire was working in Double Dykes near Perth with Gypsy Travellers. And some of that type of housing that you're talking about obviously was more related to the latter case, the latter example there with Claire, bringing it together around this concept of rights. So although maybe the geography was different, the type of housing was different, there's clearly some cultural differences there as well. Actually looking at it through a rights-based approach was actually able to bring these two things together and the campaigns together to make some headway, and they talked a bit about that. So yeah, just as you were talking about some of the housing related things, it kind of came to mind, because it was very much kind of, I mean, clearly there's a technical aspect to it, and there's a planning, and there's design and all of these sorts of things, but actually what a rights-based approach they were arguing allows to do is to go beyond just consulting with people or them having an input in a participatory way to some of the decisions that are being made about them, but takes it much more further than that, and makes it a bit more kind of fundamental and more meaningful, based around what people have a right to expect, and indeed to demand when maybe some of those expectations aren't met. So that's episode I think it was 47. If you go back, you'll find it. So yeah, very varied in terms of the influences. You sort of mentioned geography. You've mentioned sort of the visual, artistic, and creativity side of things. Quite a range of influences, as well as jurisdictions and countries as well. So yeah, well travelled. You and I, however, crossed paths at it was one of the IACD, International Association for Community Development Online events, probably 2, 3, 4 months ago. I think it was the European network were getting together, and we found ourselves in one of the little breakout rooms as we do from time to time on those events, which I would encourage if people are members, I would, and don't take part in them, I would encourage you to do so. And if you're not a member, then I would encourage you to become a member, because it exposes people working in as we do, working in different parts of the world and maybe on different particular projects, but nevertheless have quite a bit of commonality there as well.
Yeah.
But your email sort of signature, what does it say? It says socio-spatial. That's the term in there.
Yes.
Let's break some of these terms down.
Yeah, absolutely. So I also, I mean, I'm turning 30, and I had like a big decade of reflection of sorts, or reflection of my decade since I started as a graduate back in the 10 years ago. And I was very much looking at the material analysis of where I've come from and what I have been doing and why I do it, or what exactly led me here. And I think the socio-spatial word was kind of, the best representation of my passions, my interests, and what I stand for. So when I say socio-spatial, the socio is in relation to social. So very much looking at humans and relationships, and how we have either relationships with each other, but also relationships with the built environment. And I think when it comes to the spatial side of things, so very much the use of space. And I think these two really go hand in hand. However, traditional kind of architectural schooling, but also engineering schooling. And I must say, like, engineers have such a big influence in terms of our built environment. We just don't necessarily think about it that way. Like when you use a road or a bridge or even buildings, like, engineers are part of the process. And these things are so political, which is essentially social. But I think, especially through my experience working in engineering as well, we don't think about it so much that way. We tend to have a schooling that is quite apolitical, which of course over the years I've had to also unlearn myself in terms of this idea of apoliticalness, because it really doesn't exist. We live in a social environment, we live between and amongst other humans and people, and there's just no way you can be apolitical, especially when it comes to designing and the decision making of what you even design in the first place. So why are there even roads in the first place for cars? Why are there not more railways or infrastructure for public transport? Could also be vice versa. So these are all political decisions that are being made, which then as engineers we essentially practition our way into following these political decisions. And so for me personally, socio-spatial is kind of bridging these two elements together because they really do sit integratively and not in silos, and it's all interconnected basically.
And I can remember, because geography's my background, one of my degree disciplines. David Harvey, the sort of the Marxist geographer, he was a huge influence on me in terms of understanding how our economic capitalist system, that process of capital accumulation, shapes and informs and dictates how, I don't know, how high streets are configured, and why, like you said, why roads go in this direction and not that direction, and why I can't catch a bus to go to that location, or I've got to go into the city centre to then change to go out again to another part of the city, and so on. And it was really quite eye-opening to see quite how interconnected all of this stuff is, and that it does, as you say, it does have that significant kind of social, well, implications societally and socially, but are also kind of, there's like a reflexiveness then, because then people kind of push back against those things, and then campaigns start. And where I live in Cardiff, there's a civic society that is very, very combative in how it engages with issues related to green space in Cardiff and parkland. And for me, it strikes very much at some of these issues. Who has the right? That was another one of Harvey's books, right to the city. Who has the right to live in these places now? Increasingly, and again, Cardiff is very much the same, and I'm sure it's lots of other cities in the Western world, increasingly high rise. But landlords own the properties, and you get this throughput of people who don't necessarily put roots down. They're only there maybe for a few months at a time, maybe a couple of years at most before moving on. And again, like, who is the city for? Is it just for absentee landlords? Is it just for the construction firms and the design and architectural companies putting up these, dare I say, increasingly bland and homogenous sort of designs, which again takes the distinctiveness away from cities and things like that? And did a great episode a couple of years ago with Christian Noakes around some of these issues, where he looked at it very much through a gentrification lens, and was really effective in how he broke down that process of gentrification. It isn't this thing that happens overnight. It isn't a shift from this, from a state of being like this to then jump into another one. That actually it's a much longer process, which involves lots of different stages, and doesn't happen in isolation as well. Just because one area, and very much how we talk about an area being gentrified, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. It has an implication on maybe the other communities neighbouring that area that's been gentrified, because that's where the people are displaced to. So it has this knock-on implication. Really, really powerful stuff. So, I'm looking forward to discussing this a little bit more. I mentioned sort of David Harvey there, for example. I mean, are there some other maybe sort of those names, perhaps in academia, but lying outside, that maybe other people listening to this might be familiar with, or if they're curious, might want to go and start looking at in terms of this whole kind of wider discipline? Who are some of the influences for yourself?
Honestly, I think you nailed the head in terms of David Harvey. That was also, his books were also a huge reckoning for me in terms of the spatial analysis and the social implications of it, and who owns the city as well. I think in terms of names off the top of my head, I'm not great at remembering names, but there is also very interesting work that's happening at universities like TU Delft and Centre for Just Cities, for example, where people are very much discussing this more in the academic field as well. But I also think placemaking as a process and method is also highly influential when it comes to thinking about these things, and how the socio-spatial elements come together. I guess, like, for me, also just reading Marx. I know Marx might not necessarily focus on the spatial specifically, but I think by reading his understanding of capital and how it accumulates in different areas, which, factory, if you think spatially or apply the spatial dynamics, its factory is also a space. The office is also a space, public space, of course, and parks and rivers and forests. These are all spaces. And so how they're used in, for example, the trading and procurement process, that links back to the way our economy works as well. And then more broadly, political economy, I think, was basically the biggest eye opener for me personally. And I think also one guy that really does come off my head now that I'm speaking to it is Jason Hickel. I'm not sure if you've heard of him, but he also
Yeah.
talks. Oh, yeah, yeah. Yeah, awesome. No, like Jason Hickel, I guess Kate Raworth as well, when it comes to donut economics and degrowth and the critique of capital and how people, but also the built environment, have an effect on these, or there are consequences to and from. So those are really interesting people and authors to read or follow.
Yeah, another one that's come to mind as I'm listening to is Doreen Massey. I think she wrote a book. It's called, I can't remember, I want to say early 80s, it might be a little bit later, mid 80s, Spatial Divisions of Labour, and again, which touches on some of these issues as well. But she had a bit more of a gender and feminist take on some of these things as well, and essentially was trying to draw attention to how one might be in the same. So you could have two very, very different people in terms of gender, demographics, age, that kind of thing, ethnicity. Just because they're in the same place doesn't mean that they experience that place in the same way.
Yes, absolutely.
And she that again was one of those things which was like, yeah, now that you mention it, yeah, that sounds obvious, but of course, it needs to be pointed out for it to be obvious. And it's one thing knowing it and understanding it and recognizing it. It's another thing entirely doing something about it and ensuring that it's part of, I don't know, how you design parks, how you design public transport, access to public transport, and things like that. And I'm involved with a little park near me in my little suburb of Cardiff, and we had a paper report circulated by the committee members. I want to say it was from Yorkshire, somewhere up in the north of England anyway, and it was basically some research into teenage girls' experiences of parks, a park like ours. So we're not talking like the big grand civic parks, maybe in city centres, just, I say just, the very important green spaces, don't get me wrong, but your more sort of run-of-the-mill park that serves a local neighbourhood, for example, like ours. Ours is called Hailey Park, Hailey, and it was really quite stark, quite how different the experiences of parkland in, as I said, wherever it was in the north of England, I think it was Yorkshire, were for between teenage girls and teenage boys, and then indeed adults of different genders as well. But certainly just looking at it through that female lens, incredibly powerful, and it not just in terms of sort of safety, but in terms of the facilities that tend to go into these sort of places as well. Yeah, really, really quite profound stuff. So this stuff does it does matter. I would argue.
Absolutely. And even also, like, I think design is one of the key things that everyone can see when it comes to interacting with a space. And I think what's also been very interesting for me is actually understanding who owns these public spaces. Because for me, a lot of my projects when I was working in environmentally sustainable design engineering, so much of it was, you had to include like a public park or something as part of your development proposal. And so we were working on like a massive casino and hotel development in the middle of the city, and it was considered a priority development area. And so it fast tracked a lot of the community engagement processes. And then they end up owning the park space. So there's this question of like pseudo public space, like what exactly is the definition of public? Because if it's not necessarily publicly owned and it has to be, it's maintained by the private property managers or owners, and it just allows people to enter the space that might be public, but then are we allowed to use the space to protest, for example? What are the security measures that come as part of someone else that owns the space and not necessarily the government or the state, or actually being owned by the people as well?
Yeah, yeah. One of the things you sent me a range of sort of links to have a look at and read through. And one of the things that caught my eye was and you mentioned again that this visual kind of component to these things, was some of the use of sort of open source resources and wikis, and that resonates with the chapter in mine and Alan's sort of book on Policy Press last year. And I very much initially was talking about there's an episode about with Alan and I talking about the book a few episodes ago in this podcast, and I won't rehash all of that. But one of the things I'd initially been brought on to do is to contribute a chapter around the use of digital and ICT technology within community work. And it was only maybe one of the sort of stepping stones as we kind of worked away in that chapter through some of the various resources that were available, but was looking at things like GIS, Geographic Information Systems. Judith Dunlop, sadly Judith Dunlop, over in Canada, had done quite a lot of work around sort of mapping forms of participation in sort of social services and other kind of service design contexts. So trying to create more of a visual representation of these terms that we might use, a lot and justifiably so when we're using them properly, but to try to reconfigure how you communicate things like participation rather than maybe doing it in a narrative written way, or it's the use of maybe survey questionnaire data or other methodologies, but to look at it through that kind of spatial lens. And she was again quite a sort of pioneer in some of that sort of stuff. And I can remember first being, and it's in the book, first encountering GIS within this thing that we would call kind of community work, or I say community development, I mean more community work in that context. Within a local authority role I was employed by, or employed in, should I say, we had a GIS officer whose job essentially was to utilize the data that we were putting into the system, maybe mapping where grant expenditure was happening, and maybe looking at it then thematically around environment or health or whatever it might be, to then generate these images to then use both, not just for, I think initially it was for the communication of impact. And then it was okay, well, actually, what else can we do with this data and with this geographic information? Then it's looking at gaps. Then it's looking at where there's maybe, excess in certain areas and maybe imbalances, maybe in distribution of grants or forms of finance or whatever else it might be. And that was quite useful. It was another very handy tool in our toolbox. Like anything on its own, it only has a limited impact, but when you knit it together with other things, then it was quite powerful. And I was impressed with a couple of the wikis that you'd sent as well, which were in, and again, apologies if I mispronounce it, was it Maleny or Melanie?
Yes, Maleny.
In Australia. So to tell us a little bit more about the open source and the wiki and that kind of technology.
So I actually came across, I am a huge fan of citizen science, by the way, and GIS. I think they're just such great tools and methods of engaging in the community, essentially, to learn about their own environment and their surroundings. But it's like, I guess in terms of backstory, when I was working in engineering, we initiated the mapathon events actually within our offices around the world. I worked for a massive global consultancy, and there still is actually, it's called Missing Maps, so if anyone wants to check it out, do feel free to, which is an initiative by Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team, Doctors Without Borders, and then also, I've forgotten the other organisation, but essentially, Red Cross, that's the one, Red Cross. So these quite large humanitarian organisations who are also using these GIS methods to essentially map local areas for them to be able to respond to any humanitarian disasters or conflicts, emergencies, etc. And they engage the external community like employees of our engineering firm, for example, to assist with actually creating these base maps, because a lot of areas, particularly rural areas around the world, are not actually mapped. So there is no base map in terms of building footprints, roads, any rivers, etc. And so this initiative is essentially to be able to put the built environment on the map, which then also assists with the social aspects of understanding, okay, like how many people might be living here and how can we actually effectively and efficiently provide the humanitarian aid that might be required. And through that, I loved it. I enjoyed it so much that I really got into a groove. And when I moved to the Neighbourhood Centre, I applied for a fellowship with the United Nations Sustainable Development Solutions Network. And the fellowship essentially looked at how could we apply these methods for the local community in Australia. So although there are maps, so I think really in the global north, we are quite well mapped in terms of state and governments mapping our different built environments. And there's, a lot of control in terms of how that information is disseminated. However, through OpenStreetMap, which is the other platform that basically captures the information, it's completely open source, which means that anyone in the community can essentially log into OpenStreetMap and have ownership and be able to contribute the knowledge that they have. And so by using OpenStreetMap and engaging the community to actually map their own areas where they know best. So we had quite a few community members in Maleny join these mapathon events, and they were able to learn how to, draw out a building from the satellite imagery, as well as add information like how tall it is, or what is this building actually used for, if people who might be remotely mapping won't know this. So when I was in the engineering firm, we didn't know what exactly this building was used for. We were just creating the outlines. But when you're actually involving the local community, they can add like such a large wealth of information, and that then in turn can actually help mobilize the community themselves to create adaptation measures or resilience activities or interventions to be able to help each other, rather than being so dependent on external forces like humanitarian aid organisations or even the state or the government that might not necessarily know the local area as well as the community itself.
Mm-hmm. And to what extent, in your experience, do people, maybe with that job title, community development worker or community worker, some sort of variation thereof, are they working with members of the public, people in the community, to get involved in these things? Because it's all well and good to some extent playing devil's advocate here, Ritva, saying, oh yeah, it's open source, all you need to do is just kind of log in and you can contribute, you can upload data, you can use the data. But for some people there will be digital literacy issues with that, access to digital technologies. To what extent are people kind of in the middle there, kind of facilitating some of this process, maybe mediating some of those interests and where they might compete and maybe not fully align?
I think in terms of, yes, in terms of digital literacy, completely agree. It can be difficult, and I think this is where community development workers or community workers can really, if we're able to equip ourselves with understanding how to use these platforms like OpenStreetMap, we can quite easily actually teach others to become equipped in the skills as well. So when I was working on this project, a lot of the community members, Maleny is an aging population. We were a town, I think I was one of the youngest, and we don't have a huge percentage of young youth there as well, which is another urban issue within itself. But because it's an aging population, the mean age was around 60. And so the community members that actually came to these events, they Also, were not necessarily completely digitally literate, and so for me, it was very much teaching them like what tools they can use, how they can apply it, and that is really helpful, I think, for any community development worker to essentially have those skills and share them, and it becomes almost an educational process as well, which I think is really nice because the community is always very open, at least from my experience, in terms of learning new things. Like they came to the event for a reason, and so they really enjoyed being able to learn these things. And then in terms of, sorry, what was the second part of your question?
Well, no, it's just really that kind of sense that people are there in the middle in that kind of community development kind of role, bringing with it some of the values that we associate with that sort of role around looking at levelling up and making sure that there's participation across all from all sectors as far as is practicable, identifying where the power relations lie and things like that, really. But no, I think you've answered that. A motivation behind that is as much as I'm quite keen and enthusiastic to use digital platforms and technologies, and I tend to be an early adopter of these sorts of things. A podcast is a case in point. It's not enough just to kind of build it and expect people to come. I mean, some of these things do need to have that support in place in order to use. But then also the people who set things up, and as great as open source technology is, or it can be used in these ways. Well, can people then bring other uses to the table, and then these things start to begin to maybe evolve, or they take on new kind of components and new elements maybe. I always find that quite fascinating as well, and what you look at today isn't quite what it set out to be 5 years ago or 7 years ago, whatever it might be. So I find that kind of interesting as well. But I mean, certainly then in terms of the age, I mean, I think that's another thing that a lot of community workers will encounter is that the timing you might put on of events and drop-ins and things like that can sometimes advantage certain people and disadvantage others in terms of not just timing but location of these things as well. So trying to make things as accessible as possible again stands to reason, but it can be easier said than done. And do you find that some of the people in the more kind of professional technical roles find that some of this stuff is a little bit alien might be too strong a word, but again it's asking them to work in a slightly different way the moment that they're not maybe speaking all the time with peers and people who understand their terminology and their lexicon and their jargon, but to have it to do it with more of a lay population? Do you find they go through quite a learning curve as well?
I think so, absolutely. And I think, especially as someone who does come from the technical background, I also had to learn to very much drop a lot of the big words or complex words. And I mean, in the end, for me personally, it wasn't too difficult because I myself, when I learn these things, I'm like, oh, I want it as easy as possible. Because when I read like literature reviews in academia, sometimes I'm like, whoa, these words are like a bit big for myself as well. So I also like to simplify as much as I can. But I definitely think, when it comes to engaging technical experts who might not have worked with community, there can be a barrier in terms of language, so to speak, and trying to simplify things. And I think this is where conversations help a lot. So having the space to allow the community to actually raise concerns or ask questions and inquire can be really beneficial, because then the technical experts can explain a little bit more in depth what they actually mean without the heavy words, etc. Yeah,
because it's important,
absolutely.
isn't it, for people to be able to say in all capacities and creating that kind of safe space in inverted commas for people to kind of go, sorry, I don't get it, can you say that again? I don't understand, just explain it one more time. I think that's important, rather than just assume that everybody kind of is on the same wavelength and understands things, and that's just not necessarily the case. People come to things at different times, at different points within maybe a longer process as well, so that opportunity to have to bring people up to speed as well I think is always important as well, and that's something I'm kind of living with at the moment in terms of my practice with a community group in Cardiff. A couple of community groups in Cardiff, that's important to be able to go. I'm sorry, no, just explain that one more time for me, because we don't all get it at the same time and at the same pace.
Exactly. Yeah, patience is key. Absolutely.
And that's not always available to us either. That pay, or the time in that helps bring about that patience because of, I don't know, contractual obligations or funding cycles or upcoming holidays. We're recording this sort of what's today, 8th of December, so Christmas is looming. For us, we'll be sort of downing tools at some point later in the month. It can create kind of false or arbitrary deadlines or milestones within a process, and that can't always help in terms of, or it can militate against that patience and that sometimes that deliberativeness, that time for deliberation that we need to be able to kind of go back and go, okay, let's give this some further thought and come back to you.
Absolutely. Yeah. Interesting, like it's very similar to the creative design process as well. Like there's always something I feel you could do more, or I've always gone through, and I think a lot of us as designers also go through this process where it's like, oh, there's a looming deadline, we got to do as much as we can, and then you finish the deadline, it's like, oh, but I could have done this better, or I could have also implemented this. And I think this is where the iterative in, I guess, the design process, it's iterative, and I think also in community work as well, it's being able to have the funds or time or resources to come back, reflect, and then improve for the next time round and go from there. So it's always growing, building, improving upon, rather than having just one project and having one deadline and then being done with it, essentially. Yeah.
Any other work that you're involved in currently or previously that you'd maybe like to bring to listeners' attention?
I think, well, currently it's also taken a bit of a different turn with the Venn diagram of things that I've done, which is combining architecture, which is my original background, with labour rights and justice. So a lot of my work here in the Netherlands has been advocating for actually literacy around labour laws and the issues when it comes to architectural workers not necessarily feeling like they have the autonomy or the knowledge to actually stand up for themselves and be able to look after their health as well, because it really is a workplace health and safety issue when things get very stressful and you're overworked, underpaid. I've experienced this myself in my engineering background as well. So there's so many similarities when it comes to workers' rights and how do you engage with architectural workers, which are a community as well, like we're a community of professionals, to also be part of social movements or even labour movements like joining your union, etc. Whereas traditionally our work is petty bourgeoisie, so to speak. It's very much you kind of work for yourself and then you might contract several others to do work for you, but due to industrialization and commercialization, it's changed so much over history, and we haven't kept up with that kind of social, political, economic change in our own profession. So that's what I've been working on very much over the past year or so, and then applying my different skills that I've experienced and gained through working at the Neighbourhood Centre as well as engineering.
Well, and a lot of people now who fall into that petty bourgeoisie kind of category, they're finding their employment increasingly insecure.
Yes.
And that, I think, is an interesting dynamic. And again, Harvey touches on a lot of that in terms of right to the city, that sense of, we've moved from a proletariat and these locations based on or based around large industrial units and loci, steelworks, coal mines, or maybe not far from where I live, hundreds of coal mines and half a dozen in a single valley kind of thing. And that proletariat that exists around those forms of heavy industry, that proletariat is now what they call a precariat, where you've got this very dispersed, disparate, they lack some of the social connections and networks that bound the proletariat. So I don't know, your workers' institutes and some of the the miners' fortnight holiday type things, some of the cultural things that went on, sport, music, arts, politics for sure. The precariat lacks some of those, although they may have some online kind of connections. Digital communities are perhaps obviously a lot more a thing now than they would have been in previous eras. But again, a lack of power within their labour relations with those people who are employing them or not is very much marking their existence, and then how they interact and engage with space, with the urban realm, with the labour market, with the property market for certain. Now it's really fascinating stuff, and it kind of blends that. Again, that geography, the use of space with the politics and the social dimension. I think you and I could wax lyrical for ever and a day on these sorts of the themes. I think we come at them from some similar angles, perhaps.
Absolutely.
Although not the same. I mean, I'm not coming in from an architectural kind of thing or anything to do with kind of graphic design and drawing. I'm a useless artist, but I think in terms of maybe some of the politics, for sure.
Definitely.
If anyone's interested, Ritva, in kind of getting in touch or hearing a little bit more about your work and some of the projects, or accessing some of the open source technologies that you've got, and for them to get a flavour of how wikis are being used in your work and how someone might look to employ them in theirs, what would be the best way of keeping track of you, keeping tabs?
Yeah, so I guess, I've got a LinkedIn page, so you can find me quite easily. I think my name's not that popular anyway, so Ritva Vilppola, Ritva Vilppola, and then also feel free to send me an email. So that's ritva.m for Maria .vilppola@gmail.com is where you can find me, and do feel free to keep in touch.
Yes, no, and I'll drop some of that into the show notes. I mean, some of that reading that you shared with me, and maybe sort of drop a couple of those links in as well if people are interested. There was a really good one. There was like a lab. What was the event? It was like for architects. I think you said, maybe you shared with me like the online kind of resources for an in-person get-together, but there was a link to Angela Davis's book on prisons, for example. And again, it was like, oh wow, okay, so prisons, architecture, prisons. I wasn't necessarily expecting something by Angela Davis to kind of come up, albeit we're talking about gender and we touched on it, I suppose, and feminist approaches and takes on some of these things. So why not? But again, it's you can find yourself looking at some of this through a fairly sort of middle of the road kind of in a middle of the road sort of way, and then find you can go off down these, pull at these threads that then take you down into criminal justice and things like that, and no, it's fascinating. It was really good to see that there was this appetite for discussion and philosophy around that kind of gathering or that event.
Absolutely.
I haven't got it to hand. I forget exactly what it was, but I think
yes. So it's the Architecture Lobby. And that's one of our sister organisations with the Architectural Workers International, which is an initiative that I've been part of. And they're largely based in the US, but very much international as well. So you're very welcome to join their discussions, such as the prisons and Angela Davis's work as well. Definitely feel free to check it out. And it's amazing where architecture can lead you, because I also had never thought about prison design and never thought about warehouse design either. It's just not taught in architecture school. And then I went to my first job in engineering, and one of my first projects was literally working on a prison and designing it. And it's
wow. Okay.
Also a story, I guess, for another day, or feel free to reach out if you want to hear more.
Ritva, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you this morning. Not sure when this will get out. Hopefully it will be this side of Christmas. But I look forward to bringing it to people, and as I said, bringing some of the different links and things that you've shared with me to people. I really enjoyed our conversations. We've had a couple of conversations about other things that we're involved in, and other things that we'd like to pursue as well. So I'm hoping and looking forward to keeping in touch with you. But yeah, enjoy the rest of the day. Have a very Merry Christmas as well,
And for yourself.
and all the best to you.
No, thank you so much, Russell, and thank you for having me on and your time, and always a pleasure to chat with you as well.
Thank you for listening to the Community Development Podcast. And to support the podcast and help it share learning, connect the workforce, and raise the profile and the merits of community development approaches, why not become a Patreon at patreon.com/the cdpodcast.